Meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 29 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Official Languages. Le comité se réunit.
The committee is meeting on the study on government measures to protect and promote French in Quebec and in Canada.
Pour garantir le bon.
To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. First, I would like to take this opportunity to remind all participants to this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted.
Les députés.
Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting.
Click on your microphone icon to activate your mic. And when you are done speaking, please put your mic on mute to minimize any interference. A reminder that all comments by members or witnesses should be addressed through the chair. Et lorsque vous parlez, exprimez-vous.
When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly for the interpreters. And unless there are any exceptional circumstances, I believe all witnesses have a boom mic on their headset. The witnesses are with us this afternoon for the entirety of the sitting. I would now like to welcome them. First, I would like to thank them for accepting our invitation. So appearing as an individual, we have Mr. Robert Leckie, Dean Leckie, Dean and Samuel Gale, Research Chair, Professor at McGill University Faculty of Law. Also appearing as an individual, Anne-Michelle Meggs, former Director of Research at the OQLF, the French Language Board of Quebec, and from the Quebec Federation of Labour, la FTQ, Denis Bolduc, General Secretary, and Gilles Grondin, Union Advisor. Each witness or group of witnesses will have 7.5 minutes for your speech. As usual, I will use a yellow card to show you when 1 minute is left of your speaking time, and when you see the red card, it means that your time is up, or that the committee members' time is up. Let us begin with Professor Leckie. You have 7 minutes for your speech. Please go ahead.
Mr. Chair, and good afternoon.
As Dean of the Faculty of Law at McGill University, I am proud of the fact that the faculty is bilingual and bijural. Our program, offered both in French and English, integrates common and civil law. Indigenous traditions play an increasingly prominent role. Every year, our student body is made up of bilingual people from every corner of the country. If I could offer one piece of advice to the government, it would be to strengthen the learning of French as a second language in universities across Canada. As a constitutional scholar, I will devote my time this afternoon to a brief contextualization of the reform document and some of the questions it raises. Official bilingualism is deeply rooted in our Constitution. Section 133 of the 1867 Constitution Act enshrines, among other things, the right to use English and French in the Houses of Parliament and in the courts of Canada. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms enshrines official bilingualism at the federal level as a constitutional value. Section 16 states that English and French are the official languages of Canada and have equality of status and equal rights and privileges as to their use in all institutions of the Parliament and Government of Canada. This fundamental principle of the equality of status of the official languages is therefore a constitutional imperative. It should be noted that the language rights provided for in the Canadian Charter cannot be subject to the notwithstanding clause. Moreover, respect for minorities is one of the underlying principles that bring our entire Constitution to life, as recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada in the reference re Succession of Quebec. The court emphasized that although the language provisions are the result of political compromise, they reflect a broad principle related to the protection of minority rights. The reform document proposes significant changes to the Official Languages Act. The Act is the expression in areas of federal jurisdiction of these constitutional guarantees. The Act is quasi-constitutional in nature. In the event of conflict, it prevails over other federal statutes. In light of this, any amendment to the Act must be carefully and thoughtfully considered.
Let's be clear. Robust and meaningful official bilingualism at the federal level is often at odds with provinces' laws, policies, and spending priorities. In each province, official language minorities thus look to the federal level for support and defense of their rights. We see this most recently in the cry for help regarding post-secondary education in French in Ontario. The same is true in my home province of Quebec, the sole jurisdiction where the official language minority is English-speaking. It appears that the legislative proposals would represent a fundamental shift in the framework and purpose of the Official Languages Act. It's certainly open to Parliament to shift policy within its constitutional boundaries. But I wonder whether the proposals would amount to a shift away from the equality of status of both official languages as enshrined in the Charter's text. That text is appropriately interpreted in the light of the principle of the protection of minorities. Let me share two examples. First, the paper calls for recognizing within the Act the linguistic dynamics in the provinces and territories. This includes recognizing for the first time in federal law that Quebec has declared French its official language. This seems to be a sea change. As it stands, the framework of the Act is province neutral. The same legal principles apply across the Federation. What effect would this have on the interpretation of language rights for official language minorities? Recall that provinces vary. New Brunswick has constitutional language rights. Ontario has legislated ones. Some have none. Would this principle peg the demands of the Federal Act to those varying provincial guarantees? Given the Act's symbolic significance, might courts detect in such legislative language a warrant for differential interpretation of the Charter's linguistic guarantees, including Section 23? Does the proposal resile from the Supreme Court's affirmation that language rights must in all cases be interpreted purposefully, consistently with the preservation and development of official language communities in Canada? Second, the paper proposes to create or strengthen rights with respect to French, but not English. This would be another big first in federal language law. For instance, the paper proposes stating in the Act's preamble and provisions that English predominates and that French must receive increased protection and promotion. Another example concerns the protection and promotion of French. The paper proposes rights to work and rights to service in federally regulated enterprises with respect to French alone. Would these proposals effectively differentiate the status of English and French within a quasi-constitutional law? En guise de conclusion, Monsieur le Président, j'invite le comité à examiner attentivement ces propositions intéressantes. Compte tenu de la conséquence directe.
In conclusion, I invite the committee to carefully reflect on these interesting proposals. I will follow the progress of this matter with great interest. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leckie, for your speech. We will now continue to Ms. Meggs for the following 7.5 minutes. Ms. Meggs, please turn on your microphone. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's an honor to be invited to meet with the committee this afternoon. First, allow me to tell you about my professional experience, which explains my presence before you today. I began my career as a professional in the Canadian government, working on the program involving official languages in education. I also held positions of Chief of Staff for the Ontario Minister responsible for Francophone affairs at the time at which the first legislation regarding French language services was passed. I was also Director of Planning and Accountability in the Quebec Department responsible for immigration, as well as Director of Research and Evaluation at the Office québécois de la langue française. Today, I'll be focusing on the second and third goals of this exchange regarding the Canadian government's language regime and the potential amendments to the Official Languages Act to better protect French. Efficiency supposes results in relation to the investment of resources. Outside of Quebec, the results have been quite limited. In Quebec, there's no point in even asking the question because to date, the Canadian language regime has had no measure to protect or promote French in Quebec. It's only done so for English. In terms of the regime's impact on provincial steps to protect French, outside Quebec, there is no doubt that the situation of French would be in an even more fragile position without the language provisions of the Canadian Constitution and the support that the federal government provides provinces for French language education at all levels, as well as support to certain French advocacy groups. But in Quebec, the reverse is true. The Canadian government's language regime paradoxically seeks to protect the majority language of the country. Let's be clear, there is only one official language under threat in Canada, and it is French. Here are some impacts in Quebec of the Canadian language regime on the provincial efforts to protect French, as well as on social cohesion in Quebec. The Canadian Constitution contains several articles and sections that have been used to repeal large portions of the original Charter of the French language, thus limiting the Quebec government's capacity to legislate in favor of French. For example, regarding interventions in the Legislative Assembly, translation of laws, bilingualism in the courts, commercial signs, and access to English schools. The application of the Canadian bilingual regime has had a significant impact on the French face of Quebec. It's impossible for the French government to impose French-only commercial signs. Everything that is of federal jurisdiction gives an image of bilingualism, putting English at the same level as French in Quebec. Federal buildings, bridges, ports, harbors, federal parks, any federal advertising, and even advertising for any events that are funded by the federal government. The federal government is not subjected to the Quebec Charter of the French language, which gives priority of services and the right to work in French. And bilingualism is imposed on French territory of the Canadian national capital. The Canadian language regime also has brought all kinds of problems for Quebec in defending French outside of Quebec by creating false symmetry between French outside Quebec and English inside Quebec. And this extends to exclusively provincial areas of jurisdiction such as health or education. What's good for French outside Quebec is also good for English in Quebec. So if the Quebec government protests the closing of a French language hospital in another province, it's harming its own leeway in managing its own healthcare system. Likewise for education. This false symmetry also is problematic for social cohesion in Quebec. In the beginning of the 1960s, had it been recognized that French is what needs protection all over Canada, then we would have implemented the foundations for a consensus about necessary measures to achieve this goal. But we have, in fact, legislation which underlines funding to protect English in Quebec and other groups who are defending English. Finally, let's talk about the French language integration of immigrants to Quebec. The Canada-Quebec Immigration Agreement is the only document that I know in which the federal government derogates somewhat from the linguistic symmetry principle by recognizing the importance of integrating immigrants while respecting the distinct nature of Quebec society. The transfer calculations are based on the number of non-Francophones admitted into Quebec, and it's stipulated that language integration courses will be in French. But everything else involving the immigration process is managed by the federal government, thus everything is bilingual. So someone who comes to Quebec from abroad has a choice of official languages for work permits or study permits, for permanent residency, access to citizenship. At each stage, the message is clear. In Quebec, English is an official language of the new country, and it's okay and even to be expected that one chooses English. This is the very contrary of the message that Quebec is trying to send, and which is at the very basis of the Accord, which is the affirmation of French as the language of inclusion and participation. So what should be done? Are there possible amendments to the Official Languages Act which would remove these difficulties to the capacity and obstacles to the capacity of Quebec government to act in favor of French in Quebec and even outside Quebec? I am not a legal expert, as Dean Leckie is, but as I've mentioned, it has been my privilege to play a role in the adoption of the first French Language Services Act in Ontario. The government, which was a minority Liberal government at the time, determined that the true need was to ensure the offer of public services in French. Public services in English were clearly available. The Act only deals with public services and doesn't deal with the French language advocacy groups or other programs. It doesn't mention any minority. Public services are available in French in regions and offices as defined by the Act, period. It's impossible to amend the larger portion of the Official Languages Act because it generally defines the application of the sections of the untouchable Canadian Constitution. The most problematic aspects of the legislation do not come from the Constitution. They're the ones that create the concept of Anglophone minority in Canada and which propose steps to promote the development of this minority and to promote full recognition and use of English in Canadian society. It's impossible to see how this could happen while respecting the powers and jurisdictions of the Quebec government as promised in Section 42.2. In closing, I would make this recommendation. Amendments to the Official Language Act should focus on the sections which are at the basis of the idea that English is a minority language in Canada, that there is such a thing as an Anglophone minority, and that both minorities are in danger. The message is perhaps difficult to hear, but I believe it's impossible for the federal government to protect French in Quebec by promoting English. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much, Madame Michel-Meggs. And now we'll move on to our last presentation, and we'll be hearing from the Fédération des Travailleurs Travailleuses du Québec, Quebec's Federation of Labor, and I assume it's Mr. Denis Bolduc who'll be speaking to us for 7.5 minutes. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all of you. And hello, members of Parliament. I'm Denis Bolduc, and with me is Gilles Gondin, who's a francisation consultant. Thanks to all of you, and thanks for inviting us to speak to members of this very important Official Languages Committee. The Fédération des Travailleurs Travailleuses du Québec is the largest union federation in Quebec, representing 600,000 workers working in all sectors of the economy and all regions of Quebec. For over 50 years, the FTQ has been concretely involved in francisation. We have become a key player in this matter because of what we have done, because of our public interventions, and because of the positions we have taken to protect and promote the French language. At the FTQ, we adopted our first language policy in history in the late 1960s. More specifically, it was on November 21st, 1969, at our 11th convention. And this was an election year for Fernand Daou of blessed memory. He also was the president of the FTQ between 91 and 93. I'm mentioning him because he fought and he defended the right to work in French and to negotiate our collective agreements in French here in Quebec. At the very heart of the first francisation policy at the FTQ was this affirmation that French must become the language of work, the regular current language of work at all economy levels in Quebec. 50 years later, this is still a current issue. The FTQ concretely acted to defend and promote French. We have a francisation department, and we act as a catalyst for francisation committees and businesses. Over time, we have developed expertise in francisation for workers who have immigrated and who are in workplaces here. This being said, we are very pleased that the federal government wants to modernize the Official Languages Act. For us, it's simple. Anything intended to improve the place of French is welcome. And this is why we were in favor of the tabling of the white paper in February, and we hope that the government will have a more modern policy for language duality and bilingualism in Canada. Now, I have to say, in Canada, languages really are not on equal footing. It's clear to us. English is not threatened anywhere in Canada, not in BC, not in New Brunswick, not even in Quebec. On the contrary, Indigenous languages and French are increasingly threatened, including in Quebec, largely in Montreal. For the FTQ, it is essential that the federal and provincial governments take concrete measures, serious and significant measures, and that they coordinate their actions to save and promote French in Canada. Now, we recognize that the federal government is obliged to promote the principle of linguistic duality in Canada. But of the 2 official languages recognized under the Act, French is the true minority language in Canada. French is the language that's threatened, and French is the language that must be protected. And the white paper recognizes the decline of French, and we are very pleased to read that in the document. The Official Languages Act from '68 talks about institutional bilingualism. The objective is to enable Francophones and Anglophones, who are in minorities, to access services in their language and to have careers in the public service. These objectives have never been achieved for the French population outside Quebec. What is even sadder than that is that this reality is even catching up to Quebec. And that's when it comes to working in the federal public service. Our colleagues from the Public Service Alliance have often turned to us to talk to us about situations that are very difficult, especially in situations involving promotions. And for a Quebec civil servant, you have to be bilingual to be able to access certain higher positions. We don't have that same requirement in New Brunswick, a province that's recognized as being bilingual, or even in the federal capital in Ottawa. Very often, the fact that somebody doesn't speak French is not a handicap and doesn't act as a barrier to promotion. For the FTQ, it's clear. Quebec members working in the civil service should be able to work in French. End of sentence. We have been demanding for years that business and private sector, or businesses that are federally regulated, be subject to the French language charter in Quebec. The FTQ is in full agreement with the will expressed by the government to prohibit discrimination on the basis of not speaking French, or that a worker doesn't know another language other than French well enough in federally regulated businesses or in other regions of Canada where there is a large presence of Francophones. In Quebec, we're seeing a clear increase in bilingualism requirements and job offers. Francophones are often discriminated against in their hiring process if they don't speak English well. Employers take all sorts of measures to get around Section 46 of the French Language Charter. At the FTQ, we also believe that the responsibility for applying rights for language and of work in Quebec is a responsibility which we up to the Office de la langue française. The Office has expertise that dates back 45 years. The application of 2 different systems would create ambiguity. And this ambiguity is undesirable and unnecessary if you really want to improve the use of French in Quebec. As far as appointing justices to the Supreme Court, we believe that they absolutely must be bilingual. We believe that the same requirement should apply for appointments to senior management position of any major Canadian government agencies, as well as the senior public civil service. In closing, if I have time, I think I do, I wanted to say a few words about French culture and culture products in the digital and media space in both official languages. The white paper mentions the importance of promoting a cultural life in French, and that's simple for us. We are losing language and culture. The French language vitality must be accompanied by cultural life in French, rich cultural life that is diverse. Thank you very much for your attention. And the Canadian government has a major role to play, I would even say an essential role to play, in promoting French. Its role must be complementary to Quebec's role and the role of organized groups in civil society. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Bolduc. The witnesses have prepared the way for question period, and we'll begin with the first round of questions. It'll be 6 minutes each. Mr. Godin, over to you.
I believe it's my colleague. You don't have the right lineup, Mr. Chair. This has happened a few times. I don't know where we have the communication break. I don't know if you have something against me. I want to tell you that. I I really want to stick to the lineup. I'm going to give the floor to my colleague. Okay. The clock will start now. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague, Joël. He does an excellent job. It's a pleasure to work with him. I would like to thank our partners. We have witnesses that bring an extremely interesting point of view and an important study for the committee. As you know, it's the first time that the Official Languages Committee is looking at the situation of the French language in the country, and specifically in Quebec. And I would like to thank our witnesses from Quebec, Mr. Bolduc, Mr. Leakey, and Mrs. Meigs. Thank you, Mr. Bolduc. I do agree with you. Language and culture are intertwined. And we have our small artistic colony here. We have Jacob, who has just qualified for Stade Academy. But here, Mrs. Meigs, thank you for your testimony. I would like to begin by asking you to reread the last sentence of your statements. I'll let you find it because you said that it's the French language that needs to be supported in Quebec, and you said that this approach, it's a two-headed approach in Quebec, and that this is devastating. Do you have the last sentence? The last sentence of your opening statement. Mrs. Meigs, turn your mic on. Yes? Hang on, my computer's dying. I have an old computer. It's from 2011. Essentially, what I said is that I believe that it is impossible to protect French in Quebec by promoting English. It's essentially what I was trying to get at. Yes, and you talked about a false symmetry where Francophones outside of Quebec and Anglophones. Could you explain what you mean? I think that Mr. Bolduc spoke to this as well. And I think you've already heard a lot of testimony on the state of the situation. So it becomes so that there's only one language that is in decline in Canada, and it is in decline to the benefit of English, of course. And Mrs. Meigs, you said that the efforts of the federal government outside of Quebec have supported Francophone communities, but in Quebec, it has had the opposite effect. It has hindered French as a common language. Am I right? Is this a correct interpretation? Yes. Yes, I would say that. As I was saying, I worked for several years for Francophones in Ontario in particular. And this is why I used this example. We didn't try to declare English or French or to try to declare Ontario officially bilingual. We said we want to make sure that there are services for Francophones wherever they live. And this is how we try to address it. Most of the Official Languages Act does the same thing federally. It talks about services with regards to federal institutions. When you start to say that there's a minority, an official languages minority in Quebec that should be at the same level as the Francophone minorities outside of Quebec, my experience, even my personal experience, because I worked in both situations, and on the English side, things are going swimmingly in Quebec. It's not a challenge to live in English in Quebec. You said that the federal government's policy in Quebec was hindering the ability to project an image of a Francophone Quebec. In Lévis, you have the huge sign in both official languages. I recently had a friend who wrote a message because he went across the Champlain Bridge and he lives in the Laurentian. And he said, wow, everything is bilingual. I said, well, yes, it's a federal sign. All the signs. Well, he was absolutely surprised. I said, well, no, of course, this is what happens. And we see this in the metros. All the signs are in both languages for COVID or for whatever. So the Official Languages Act does impose this. It imposes it. Yes, it imposes English on Quebec. So could I say this is what the Official Languages Act imposes, and with the fact that the Canadian government now recognizes that the French language is in decline and needs to be protected, that it is a minority language, should that change? Answer. I would like for the choice of the Quebec government to be respected in Quebec. But this is incompatible, I might say, with a law that insists that everything be in both official languages throughout Canada. I mentioned that signage, for example, is not unilingual. And this is not even an issue of the charter. Right. Thank you very much. You also spoke about immigration. It was a conservative government.
Merci beaucoup.
Bon,
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Blaney. Your time is past. Now, Mrs. Latanzio, 6 minutes, please. Mrs. Latanzio, thank you. I would like to thank the witnesses for appearing here today. Note that your participation here today will allow us to continue to work on this study, this very important study. My questions today will be asked to Dean Lakey. Dean Lakey.
But your introductory piece was exquisite in that you asked several very pertinent questions, and I would ask you and I would invite you that you not only file your introductory remarks, but if you can also pen to us the responses that you would want, or what the responses, your opinions and responses to the questions that you brought up in your introductory speech, which I find again very pertinent. So my question to you is the following. We've heard some contradictory remarks from members of the opposition with regards to linguistic regimes and jurisdictions. While the opposition has asked the federal government to take a bigger role in the rest of Canada when it comes to Quebec, the opposition openly gives precedence to the Quebec National Assembly to legislate on all linguistic matters. So my question to you is, can you speak to this overlap of linguistic regimes, and also can you speak to each level of government's jurisdictions with regards to the official languages? Mr. Lakey.
Thank you very much for your comments and for the question. I will be pleased to share the document I read. Honestly, some of the questions I asked are genuine questions for which I don't have an answer to fill in and send your way. I mean, part of the delicacy of modifying a quasi-constitutional law is that it's hard to know for sure what its effects will be, how it will be interpreted informally by public servants carrying out their mandate, how it will be interpreted by courts. So I will think carefully about how much more I can answer, but they were genuine questions that I was sharing with you about the potential interpretive consequences.
I think they were excellent questions.
Thank you. In terms of legislative or constitutional competence, neither order of government in our federation has exclusive authority over language. Rather, each of the orders of government in the execution of their other duties, as they legislate in respective matters within their authority, they are able to deal with linguistic dimensions. So the Parliament of Canada, as it deals with other matters within its authority, can deal with the linguistic dimension. Provinces, it's the same case. So it's kind of hardwired into our constitutional structure, if you will, the idea that there could well be linguistic laws, rules, regimes programs, priorities at the two orders of government. And as I hinted, at times there's a bit of a tension between them in the sense that the kind of bilingual dual regime at the federal level at times certainly isn't one that each province would have adopted. And so it can be a fruitful tension, as tensions can be. At times, of course, various stakeholders will perceive that tension as less fruitful.
Okay. And with regards to federally regulated businesses, is the federal government within its full jurisdiction to impose the OLA?
Yes, certainly. Yes, as I understand the constitutional jurisprudence.
Okay. The OLA has been recognized, as you mentioned a few times, as a quasi-constitutional act by the Canadian courts, especially the Supreme Court of Canada. We've heard previous testimony regarding its privileged status in comparison to other federal statutes, especially those that would be inconsistent with it. What would be the place of the OLA within the larger Canadian legal framework, and how does it harmonize or relate to other jurisdictions which have their own linguistic regimes?
Well, within the federal legislative ecosystem, if you like, the sort of understanding of the Official Languages Act as quasi-constitutional means that in a case of conflict with another law, it might be taken as prevailing over it. It can be also perceived to represent a particularly kind of strong or clear representation of Parliament's will. So there can be a kind of indirect influence from it as well, outside a case of a kind of direct conflict. In terms of the relationship with provincial laws, in a sense, that was one of my open questions. What's the kind of relationship if the federal law is going to take account of the linguistic situation in the provinces or territories? What exactly will that mean? Is that a demographic statement, a sociological statement? Is that a legal statement where legal interpreters, judges applying federal law are to take account of the legal regimes on the ground in the different provinces? That was one of the questions I had on which I thought greater clarity might be in order. There's a big difference between taking account of numbers of the population and taking account of a province's laws.
So how would we strike that balance?
I mean, you might need to identify a little more clearly what the objective was that you were pursuing with that language, and perhaps try to sharpen that language. It struck me as subject to a range of interpretations as it is now.
Okay. I'd like to hear your opinion on the lack of harmony that exists between the different linguistic regimes, as some provinces, and you alluded to that before, have robust linguistic protections and services for the minority language communities across the countries, and others like BC that don't even have a policy on French services, or Alberta, which has created a policy as recent as 2017.
Excuse me, Mrs. Lattanzio, your time is over, so maybe Mr. Leke will respond to that later.
Thanks.
So,
can he respond to it now, Mr. Chairman? I finished asking the question. Or shall I ask for him? Oh.
Yeah, no, you already asked the question, but your time is expired. So next round, you can ask again, Mr. Leke, to answer that question.
Just in case, Mr. Chairman, I don't mean to impede on anybody else's timeline, but in case I do not come back, would Dean Leke provide me the answer in writing? That would be sufficient for me as well.
Merci beaucoup. Donc c'est entendu.
Thank you. Most of the witnesses have sent their speaking notes. They were not distributed because we don't have them in both official languages. The analyst does have them, and we can use them for the report. So, moving on, I will give the floor to Mr. Beaulieu for 6 minutes. Thank you. First of all, I would have a question for the FTQ. You spoke a lot about the importance of the language of work, and you also mentioned that in a document there should be one way to apply the law. The government of Quebec and its demands with regards to the modernization of the Official Languages Act says that there's only one minority language that's threatened in Canada, it's French, and that they should be masters of how linguistic rules are applied on their territory. What do you think of this position by Quebec? Answer. I think that we were clear. I was clear on this in my presentation. Yes, there is one language that is threatened, only one, and that is the French language. Surveys were conducted very recently, and 2 out of 3 businesses on the island of Montreal would like, during hiring, that the people hired be bilingual.
Montréal.
That's 2 out of 3 businesses in Montreal. And just there, that is an indication. We wouldn't want to go to Montreal and go into a business and find no one speaking French there. Yes, and French is declining as a common working language. And I would say that the Official Languages Act, as we said, aims only to strengthen English in Quebec. So for all of it, grant programs, all of what we call positive measures, whether it be for schools, for post-secondary, I think it's about $50 million for support, and some of the funds go to English-speaking advocacy groups and so forth. And I think that this did considerable harm to French in Quebec when we think of it as a common language and as a language of work. Now, regarding positive measures and French assimilation or Francization, should the federal funds be equitably distributed for French and English, and especially to strengthen Francization initiatives? I would ask Gilles to answer because he works closely with French language communities. Gilles? If I may, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Denis. Yes, there are some Francization efforts in enterprises for businesses with 100 employees and more in Quebec. And yes, in some cases, it is more effective than others. I think that using French as a language of work is not always a priority, but there are very numerous union issues to deal with in a workplace. The Quebec government is asking for positive measures because this was under the radar often in Quebec. Funds for official languages were between $880,000 and $100,000 per year, which has a significant impact. Now we see that with the current government, we will see that opposition parties are in favor of applying Bill 101 to federally regulated private businesses. The Liberal Party is against it. Do you think that the OLA could be modified to favor French? And when we think, or rather, you mentioned the PSAC. When PSAC came to the committee, they discussed a deeply entrenched discrimination in the federal public service because everything happens in English first. Do you think there's a way to amend the OLA to make French the common language? If the Liberals succeed in defeating that legislation, the language of work will continue to be in favor of English. Well, PSAC probably told you, but if they didn't, they told us that there is a strong proportion of federal public servants who work either in New Brunswick or Gatineau in so-called bilingual regions who are not comfortable speaking French at work, which is a problem. Yes, 44% say they are uncomfortable speaking French at work. So we're far from the target there. My next question is for Ms. Meggs. I think it was very important what you said about how a person arriving from abroad can come into Quebec and for study permits, for permanent residency, etc. At each step, the message is clear. In Quebec, English is an official language of the country, and it's permissible, even normal, to choose English. So doesn't the OLA go against what the Charter of the French Language tries to achieve? Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Ms. Meggs may be able to respond to your question during the next round of questions. We're out of time, unfortunately. Now, Ms. Ashton has 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, my questions will be for Mr. Bolduc. First of all, I would like to share all of my solidarity and that of the entire NDP caucus with you. The workers at the Port of Montreal today were betrayed by the Trudeau government. We can see that this government is not a friend of workers. This is a government that uses its ability to resort to these measures. My colleague Alexandre Boulris and our leader Jagmeet Singh and other members spoke in the House to denounce this legislation, and we will continue to stand up for workers in the Port of Montreal. Let's talk about the failure of the Liberal government. The pandemic showed us that they are not serious about defending the 2 official languages. The Public Service Alliance of Canada was clear. If before the pandemic, French was a second thought, it is even more so after the pandemic. To maintain the bilingual labor force in the federal public service, what are your comments about bilingualism requirements for certain positions? Do you have alternatives? Thank you, Ms. Ashton. First, for your comments about dock workers at the Port of Montreal. I won't get into that any further today, but now regarding bilingualism, we often see this. I sit on the OQLF, and regularly they have requests regarding jobs that have to be bilingual in certain businesses. That can be recognized, but sometimes I see files on 150 jobs in one business, and the business confirms that it needs 130 bilingual workers. And this notion is getting stretched to its limits to require people to master both languages in the workplace. And I referenced this in my introduction. There comes a point when the person who ends up being penalized is the francophone in their own province, in their own city, which are both mainly francophone. People who don't speak English are often live in the Quebec regions. In Montreal, many people do speak English, but often people find themselves in situations where jobs are posted. And, of course, under law, it's not possible to discriminate if someone doesn't know English. But in Quebec, a person should not lose access to a job if that person does not speak English. But in reality, this is what we are seeing, and there needs to be a mechanism to put an end to this. Someone who is applying for a job and who speaks French should not be rejected for not speaking English. We're always advocating for the right to speak in French, And we will continue to demand this right, and there need to be measures to ensure that this is the reality and that certain businesses don't go against this. You also propose that businesses with 150 employees or more should put in place joint francization committees so that they can have watchdogs for use of official languages in the federal service. Can you comment on, or in the workplace rather? Can you comment on that? Well, yes, that would be very helpful. The number of businesses with 100 employees or fewer make up the vast majority of businesses in Quebec. For small businesses to be subject to that type of measure where they would have to set up francization committees would be very welcomed. It would be positive for the protection of French in Quebec. And I just have 1 minute left. But finally, what are your expectations for the modernization of the OLA? Well, one thing that we were pleased to see in the document was that finally the government is recognizing the decline of French everywhere in Canada, including in Quebec. So no later than 2 or 3 months ago, and and I was challenged on this assertion that French is on the decline in Quebec. And I find that just seeing it written in black and white in this government document is already a welcome recognition that can be helpful. Thank you, Mr. Bolduc, and thank you, Ms. Ashton. We will now move on to Mr. Dalton for 5 minutes, please. Excellent. Thank you. And thank you to all of our witnesses for your comments. During the 70s, my father was stationed with the military, and I studied in an Anglophone school. I did my high school there. There were 2 Catholic schools, English-speaking, 1 Protestant school. And the majority of workers in that community were French speakers. They were leaders, but it was the leaders and the engineers and these higher positions that were English speakers. So they and their children made up the people who would go to these schools. Now there is 1 Francophone school, and 60%, the majority, are Indigenous, Cree. So that change is very remarkable. My question is for Mr. Bolduc. I know that since the 60s, your vision has been for French to be the language of work everywhere. Is that a reality now? Do you see a significant difference? Over the past 10 years, have you seen a significant difference? What has the change been? Thank you, Mr. Dalton. I was born in 1962. And when I was a very small boy, my father worked in the mines in that same region you mentioned. And as you say, many jobs were in English. There were incredible incidents in those mines during those years. And I'm not going to say that it was because of problems with the languages being used, but perhaps if things were done differently, those incidents could have been avoided. I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. You brought me back to my childhood. What school did you go to? Oh, I was too young to be of school age at that time. But over the past 10 years, I think the decline of French has continued. I live in Quebec City, and I work here in Montreal, and it is indisputable in Montreal that the situation of French is deteriorating, and increasingly businesses are asking that their staff be bilingual. And it's very frequent when it comes to immigration for people to speak 3 or even 4 languages. It's a strength to speak a second or a third language.
We have to encourage the use of English at work. And we find that as soon as one Anglophone is in a room, a meeting, even if it's in Montreal, there's a reflex and everybody switches and starts speaking English. So the majority adapts to the minority. That's a reality. And we see this in Quebec. I've been on, I was a member of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and it was a cross-Canada union. I've never saw a meeting where a French language minority, of which I was one, made everybody around the table end up speaking French. Didn't happen. Well, in this committee, it's the reverse. Anyhow, that's well and fine. Ms. Meggs, necessary steps to defend French, according to you? Well, I think Quebec has established this language, the kind of language development it wants to see. The Charter of the French Language was, I think, the second bill that the PQ government brought in 76, 77. And it was to strengthen, did this at several levels. They did this for education. They said everybody should go to French school. There were some sections for people who had gone to primary school in English in Quebec. They were allowed to send their children to school in English. But everybody else, including newcomers, new arrivals, had to go to French language school. That was the strongest measure that helped the most. Thank you, Madame Meggs. I have to stop you there, unfortunately. So now the floor is over to Mr. Arsenault. You have 5 minutes. Mr. Arsenault. Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all of our guests. I may not have time to speak to everybody, but we're listening to everything you say, and what you have to say is important. I'd like to begin with Mr. Leakey, because I'd like to hear the answer to the question that was asked by Patricia Latanzio. The answer would be of great interest to me. Her question was about the fact that in the different jurisdictions of this fine country, this confederation that has provinces and a federal government, there are provinces that don't have the same language regime. I'm from New Brunswick. We're officially bilingual, constitutionally bilingual. Quebec has its Bill 101. Other provinces are more in a position of assisting French, like in Ontario. So how do you see the Official Languages Act, despite the different language regimes that are not the same across the country, how is this Official Languages Act, how was it able to promote the development of language minorities? Well, the fact that there's variation from province to province reflects different histories and different political choices that are different within provincial jurisdictions. So that diversity is one of the predictable consequences of our federal system. That's to be expected, that there be differences between provinces. I would emphasize the potential, the positive potential for Canada at a federative level to ensure some sort of a harmony and standardization of vision in this constitutional bilingualism. I think there's a positive role for the Canadian Parliament to play, even if the legislative choices of provinces may vary from one province to the other. So I see a source of wealth rather than inconvenience that there are different choices made between the federal government and the provinces. Do you see this white paper on the reform of the Official Languages Act? It has the necessary tools to achieve what you're talking about, in other words, so that we could be able to assure this promotion by harmonizing what hasn't been harmonized in other jurisdictions. Could you repeat the question? In this white paper on the Official Languages Act, which promises a reform, do you see in it the essential tools that would allow this major federation to achieve this goal of promoting the language rights as much as possible, despite the fact that there are different jurisdictions with different protections for minorities, for language minorities? Well, strengthening accountability to make sure that there's accountability in terms of the implementation of federal obligations. That's something positive. I think there are all kinds of suggestions in the document. I think that there is federal responsibility that cannot be neglected. In the constitutional framework, I think that there is federal responsibility which is distinct, and then there's each province which has its responsibilities. According to the current constitutional framework, I understand the federal responsibility to affect the protection and promotion of both official languages and their equality of status. Mr. Leckie, I am a lawyer by profession, and I'm a graduate of the Moncton Law School, which was the first, I believe, a law school that taught common law in French. And I practiced, imagine, a lawyer that practiced common law 99% in French during my 23-year career. Isn't that the kind of success that the Official Languages Act brings to us, or the promotion of language rights with respect to the federal government? Yes. I think the Moncton Law Faculty's success is really a success story and impressive. One of the tragedies is that Quebec judges can work in French and render judgments in Quebec, but they're never translated. So provincial judges in Quebec make judgments, but the other judges elsewhere can't benefit from them because their judgments are not translated. So they remain in French only. I think that there are things that we can be proud of in Quebec jurisprudence, and in this case law is not being presented, and you're absolutely right. Thank you very much, Mr. Leckie and Arsenault. We will now move on to Mr. Beaulieu for 2 minutes and 2.5 minutes. I'd like to give Ms. Meg the chance to answer my last question. In other words, federal language policy, by constantly conveying the message that English is an official language and promoting institutional bilingualism, is this something that doesn't end up harming the integration and inclusion of new immigrants' arrivals in their integration into Quebec? I would say yes. Clearly, even the Charter of the French Language and the Canada-Quebec Agreement recognize it's almost that this accord is is a counterpart to the Official Languages Act because it recognizes French in Quebec. It recognizes that you need Francisation in Quebec. Quebec wants to convey the message that French is the language of integration and inclusion and participation. To be able to participate in Quebec and play an active role in Quebec, it ought to be done in French. We want a common language. But the fact that English is so strong, there's such an attraction, and even the temporary immigration is happening much more than permanent immigration. People can arrive with no language requirements. They can work and study in English for a few years, and then they can make an application for permanent residency. So yes, it goes against it. So I would ask a similar question to the people from the FTQ. to make French the common work language, the common language of the workplace, do you think that the institutional bilingualism approach of the federal government is harming the Francization of workplaces? I didn't understand the question. My internet is a little bit spotty. If you want to make French the common language of the workplace, do the federal government's efforts to promote bilingualism, institutional bilingualism in English language services, isn't that this weakening Francization of the workplace? Aren't these two approaches in contradiction with each other? If I may jump in here, I think in people's minds this creates huge ambiguity. So right from the get-go, this ambiguity creates a difficult dynamic when afterwards we try to impose French in the workplace. So right from the beginning, that's what I could say. You know, get that, I see you with your little red flag there. But that's what this creates. Yes, that prevents Francization in some cases. Thank you, Mr. Gondin. I would like to ask the clerk to check whether there is a technical problem with Mr. Bolduc to ensure that he can continue to answer questions during the next round. And now the floor is over to Ms. Ashton for 2 minutes, please. 2.5 minutes. Thank you. My question is for Ms. Meggs. What can the government do to promote the integration of newcomers in minority societies? How can we give them the wish to learn and preserve French and to convey this wish to their children? Well, that's a big challenge. Already, people who are born of French-speaking parents outside Quebec start shifting over to English. It's very difficult to get people from outside Quebec and to bring them outside Quebec and think that they're going to be able to live in French. This was a challenge even when we had the French Language Services Act passed. We wanted to be sure that whatever services we were implementing were like going against the grain of Ontario civil servants in a way. We wanted to be sure that these services would be used. So we launched a campaign, you know, saying, I'm going to use French. And this was a campaign for Francophones so that they could choose French. So we have to encourage them. We have to be sure that there are connections made between French language advocacy groups and newcomers. Now, should the federal government be doing that? Or is this something that each province should be doing? Because a lot of the services to newcomers are provincial. In immigration, that's really largely it. So is it for a work permit, a driver's license, health services, all of that? So it's not so simple. There are not a lot of provinces outside Quebec where you can do all of that in French. It's a challenge. But we did find different ways when the French Language Services Act was implemented. So even by doing it remotely, you know, having in liquor stores, if you didn't have the bilingual expertise in every location, people could just pick up the phone and call an expert to find out what kind of wine they ought to be drinking with their meal. So there are different ways, you know, with working from home, remote work now. There are ways of encouraging this. We have to be innovative. Thank you very much, Ms. Meggs and Ms. Ashton. And now to complete this round, we have 2 5-minute interventions. This time it's over to Mr. Godin to begin. Now you've got the lineup correct. And by the way, I don't mean to imply that there was any lack of respect for your chairmanship, but I just, I know that there was a confusion in terms of the schedule. I just want to be sure that everybody understood whose turn it was. So I'd like to thank the 3 organizations present today. I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this study. I would like to get back to this study. It's about steps the government is taking to protect and promote French in Quebec and in Canada. Sincerely, I think that we are going overboard here, and we're losing sight. We're losing the forest for the trees. There's a problem of the decline of French in Quebec, but we can't manage this in the entire country. The Official Languages Act, the white paper, is going to do things to protect the equality of both official languages. But going beyond that, aren't we getting away from the problem of French and protecting and promoting French in Quebec by putting it into this whole grand category of Canada? I'd like to hear what Mr. Leckie has to say about this regarding the Charter and the principles of the rights and the law for French and English. Do you truly believe that if we were to work globally, we'll be able to find solutions to promote and protect French in Quebec?
Pouvez-vous répéter la question?
Could you repeat the question? Yes. If we look at the situation overall, the rights of Francophones and Anglophones with the Official Languages Act, do you think that we can resolve this issue of the promotion and protection of the French language in Quebec? I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't think either level of government will solve this definitively. It's a multi-generational issue, so I'm not going to be able to find a solution to solve this. And people are seeking to promote French in Quebec and outside of Quebec. For me, there's not one single solution to this. For me, the start point is the constitutional framework, the equality of status of both official languages. Up until now, the Government of Canada has implemented a context that has been applied very uniformly throughout the country. My objective today was not necessarily to make any kind of predictions, but rather to shed some light on the scope of the changes being proposed, and to invite you to make sure that the things that you're proposing, that you're setting forth, are enlightened. And so the question was to see to what extent we might be getting away from what's found in the current charter with what you're proposing, for example, when you talk about the promotion of French language in Quebec. So that, thank you. Thank you. You're setting the table so that we can be very rigorous, and we don't want to be anti-constitutional, but we do have to be very targeted in our approach to find solutions to the problem. Linguistic minorities in Canada do exist. The decline of the French language exists in Quebec, and these are two separate issues. I'd like to hear Mrs. Meigs. You spoke about certain deficiencies, that there was nothing to protect Francophones in Quebec, and I'd like to have your opinion. And I'd like to know what you propose as a solution to allow the French language to take its place in Quebec. Answer. My conclusion is that we have to try to make sure that what is implemented in order to respect federally both official languages does not undermine the efforts made by Quebec to protect the French language. And if I look at the Official Languages Act, I found that where it becomes, as Mr. Bolduc was saying, ambiguous was when you start saying that there's an equivalency between English in Quebec and French outside of Quebec, and that is not the case at all. And sorry, nobody is going to convince me otherwise. I've been looking at these figures for years, and that's just not the case. So we have to look very carefully. Dean Leckie is saying this. We have to be careful. We have to make sure that the way that both official languages are applied in the Official Languages Act doesn't Sorry, your time is up. I understand. Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Lefebvre for the next 5 minutes. Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to all our witnesses who are joining us here today. It's very interesting. I'm from Sudbury. I'm from Kapuskasing, and I admit that my family and myself have 5 generations of Quebecers and Acadians living in Northern Ontario, and we speak French. Before going to Montreal, I was a student at University of Ottawa, and I went to see a Canadiens game at the Forum. They did lose at the time. They played against the Flyers. But anyway, the second time was with my wife, and we went to see Francis Cabrel. It was a show, and as Franco-Ontarians, we live in French, but as Mr. This is a very fascinating study because we look at Quebec as being the beacon of the French language. And my Francophone friends in Quebec say, no, we have problems here too. So as Daryl Sasso was saying, when we wake up in the morning as French Canadians, we know that we're going to have a fight on our hands to protect our culture and our language. And so we have to wake up every day and do the same thing. And Mr. Arsenault, I did my law degree in common law at University of Ottawa. And even though I'm not a constitutional expert, I'm a fiscalist, I understand the importance of the constitutional aspect. This gave me my French language education, and my children also have had access. We know it's difficult for high school because of the fact that it's a provincial jurisdiction and not a federal jurisdiction to try to support post-secondary education. My question is the following. When we talk about the linguistic rights that exist now in Canada, we are seeking to protect the French language in particular. So we have created a system with French language schools in order to protect the French language throughout Canada. But if we look at the case law with regards to linguistic rights, especially if we talk about charter schools, can we say that the symmetry adopted by the Supreme Court was favorable to Francophones throughout Canada? I'd like to hear you speak on this. I agree with you that the generous interpretation given by the Supreme Court of Canada of Section 23 has been mostly to the benefit of minority French language communities outside of Quebec. The decision last week on Bill 21 surprised some people. They didn't follow the case law, according to which the Supreme Court recognized that there's the right to manage their own institutions. And this case law usually was to the benefit of French language communities. Yes, if we look throughout the country and look at case law, we have challenges with the provinces that do not want to recognize quasi-constitutional rights, the right to an education in French, something that comes from Section 23. If we look at the Western provinces, for example, this is a huge challenge, and it's very difficult. I've visited regions with many French families. They want French language education for their children. They have to take a bus for 1 hour time to get to a French school. And this is very challenging. So access is a huge challenge. You have something to say. Answer. In Quebec, sometimes. Well, let me highlight the right to access to justice in the English language is not always ensured in Quebec either. So maybe you can be served on St. Catherine Street, but in the institutions of the province, this is not always the case. So I do understand when the members of the committee say that English is not a threat, but the fact that you would have a law clerk and a judge It's not guaranteed that the judge will be able to speak English. That's interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Members of the committee, we've gone through one complete turn. We have 35 minutes left. So what I'm suggesting is this. We'll do one turn per party represented, a 7-minute turn by party represented. So you can separate out the time with your colleagues as you see fit, and we will end at 5:30. 7 minutes each. So 7 minutes. Mr. Godin, first of all. And if he wants to share his time with someone else, he can say. Go ahead. Question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll share my time with my colleague, Stephen Blaney. I'll leave him 2 minutes, if that's okay. I see that, yes? Sometimes it's nice to be able to see people in a video conference. So, Mr. Chair, let me continue for Mr. Bolduc. First of all, I was understanding that you represent 600,000 workers in Quebec. Within your businesses, do you have any businesses that fall under a federal jurisdiction? Yes. Yes, we have several. We have several thousand members that are under federal jurisdiction. This is true in the communication sector. Dock workers in Montreal, port workers. This is a federal jurisdiction. They're members of the FTQ, members of the PSEC as well. Yes, so if I come back to the possibility of choosing the language of work, when we're an employee of a federal jurisdiction, it's intimidating if you have one francophone in a meeting. Well, you can say that you want to work in French, but the francophone will not be able to do that. Would it be possible to impose the fact that you work in French on the territory of Quebec for companies under federal jurisdiction or employees under federal jurisdiction? Yes, I was talking about civil servants who work in Gatineau, and they're really intimidated, and they really don't want to speak French at work. They feel uncomfortable, and so I don't think that should be the case. If you have a francophone work setting, well, French should be spoken, and as I was saying, it's happened regularly for me to be in meetings outside of Quebec or even inside of Quebec. As soon as there's an Anglophone present, of course we're going to switch to English. Yes, as a Quebec citizen, if a tourist speaks to us in English, of course we're going to speak in English. So we do have a responsibility to promote French. Yes, we have the responsibility when we go to a store, for example, in Quebec, and somebody answers in English, we have the responsibility of asking to be served in French. Mr. Bolduc, you mentioned following the publication of the White Book, you're hoping for modernization, but you recognize that there's a decline in French, especially in Montreal. Let's recognize that. And you're pleased to see the publication of the White Book or the White Paper. And so between the intention and action and concrete action, here's my question, Mr. Bolduc. What for you would be the most important measure to be implemented right now in order to have a significant impact in order to stop the decline of the French language in Quebec? As a parent, our responsibility is with regards to our children. We have to set the example. So without having thought about this too much, if the federal government in its public service, in its institutions, set an example on the territory of Quebec, this would be of great assistance. Thank you, Mr. Bolduc, and to the other witnesses. I would have had questions, but I said I would share my time with my colleague from Rive-Sud in Quebec.
Thank you very much, my dear colleague. The question will be for Mr. Leckie, and I would like to ask it to all three witnesses. Mr. Leckie, do you recognize that French in Quebec is minority within North America? Yes, of course. And do you recognize that the federal government must take specific measures to protect French in Quebec in this context? In which way? Well, given that French is a minority within Quebec, doesn't the federal government have the responsibility to promote one of its national languages in Quebec? I won't comment on that. Well, I will ask my question to Mr. Bolduc. Mr. Bolduc, you said it yourself. French is a minority language in the North American context. And in your opinion, does the federal government have an increased role to play to protect and preserve French in Quebec under Bill 101? Or rather, under the Official Languages Act? Yes. It must be accepted that there are different realities, whether you're in Quebec or elsewhere in Canada. Can we seriously claim that English requires the same protection as French? Thank you, Mr. Bolduc. Ms. Meg, do we need to put an end to false asymmetry? Preserving French in Quebec, in order to preserve French in Quebec. Yes, a bit as we have already done in the field of immigration. Mr. Leckie, how do you see an asymmetrical approach by the federal government, or an approach to recognize French's minority status in Quebec? And what is the role of the federal government to preserve French in Quebec? I find that this is a complex question because obviously the federal government has a constitutional responsibility to protect and promote the minority official language in Quebec, which is English. So the federal government must also respect its constitutional duties. Well, I'll end on this because you began by saying that the federal government had the responsibility to protect the rights of minorities. And here we're recognizing that French within Quebec is a minority. So I thought that you would say that, yes, the federal government does have that responsibility to protect French in Quebec. Excuse me. Thank you very much. Excuse me. Time is up. Now we will move on to Ms. Martinez-Ferrada for 7 minutes. You may also share your time. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be sharing my time with my two colleagues, Patricia and Marie-France, who will both be asking questions after me. I have a question on immigration. There's a report by the CAQ government that said that 44% of new arrivals to Quebec did not speak French. And when it comes to immigration levels, in the economic category, that percentage immediately shot up over 50%. I'm interested in the link between the settlement of economic immigrants and the French fact. How can we ensure that French is protected? Could you comment on your initiatives and what would you wish to see? What else would you like to see done in the white paper on that? I can answer, Denis, if I understand the question. When it comes to immigration, this is very, very important for the future of French in Quebec. There's also the whole idea of making sure that Bill 101 is maintained in schools. It's very important. There are many other considerations. Inaudible for the interpreter. Inaudible for the interpreter. Mr. Grodin, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to hold up my microphone. So I think it will be extremely important to maintain language rights for French so that there need to be more measures for the French fact. The measures we take in the union are to the effect of making sure that Bill 101 is implemented and that French workers can work under the proper conditions. And that is another important element. I'm not sure if I fully answered that question. Well, if you have other ideas, you can send them to us in written form. I think that, as you said earlier, immigration is still a very important point when it comes to the future of French. So initiatives must be supported, including through unions. But this is not only a question of language of work, it is also a question of the labor force when we think of incoming immigrants. Yes, the next challenge will be to make sure that workers speak French. Ms. Meg, quickly, please, so I can give more time to my colleagues. Yes, I would like to mention two things. I would say that we're starting to see a shift. There's a temporary improvement in immigration in two ways. People come in temporarily and other immigrants stay permanently. And I'm thinking that perhaps another agreement should be made between the federal government and the Quebec government that would take temporary immigrants into consideration once they arrive in Quebec. That would be helpful. Also, I think there's already been a proposal in Parliament about people who become citizens in French and requiring them to have knowledge of French when they become Quebec citizens. I think that would be a strong message to send, to say that if you want to belong in Quebec and belong to Quebec society, you must know French. Yes, I am an immigrant myself, and I didn't speak French when I became a Canadian citizen, so I think this issue is more on Francization, but I'm very pleased to discuss this with you. I'll give the rest of my time to my colleagues. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our witnesses. My question is for Ms. Meg. I would like to look at a more detailed picture of the language of work in Montreal and in Quebec. There was a highlight that came out of the OQLF's report on follow-up of the language of work for 2001 to 2016. When it comes to the language most used at work, the OQLF reported that in over 20 neighborhoods, the majority of participants in that survey used French as their language of work. I would like to look to the west and in the center, on the island of Montreal, for example, French is used, but trends do vary, and the island of Montreal does not represent all regions. Can you comment on this? Can you repeat the question? Can you comment on those variations in language of work? Well, there are variations, but the message should be that ideally work should be done in French. That means Francophones should stop switching to English every time they work with an English-speaking colleague. If we look at the same data, we would see that the majority of Anglophones are capable of carrying on a conversation in French. There's also the question of increased Francization for immigrants in the workplace. So if you have English-speaking immigrants, those employers should help those immigrants to learn French. Perfect. I will give the rest of my time to Patricia. Thank you. Thank you to my colleague. The last question will again be for Mr. Leckie. Inaudible for the interpreter.
Et je me suis retrouvée à étudier le droit complètement dans une université francophone au Québec et je pense que justement, c'est toute une richesse de pouvoir parler les deux langues de ce beau pays. Donc, Monsieur Leakey, with regards to the linguistic and overlap of the linguistic regime, can you
Madame
concede?
Lattanzio,
Yes, madame.
Yes.
je vais vous interrompre, mais je crois que vous n'avez
oui.
pas votre casque.
Mon casque. Désolée. Aïe, aïe, aïe.
Et Madame Lattanzio, il vous reste 15 secondes là, à votre temps.
Ms. Lattanzio, you have just 15 seconds left. I'm not sure if Mr. Leckey was able to hear your question, but you can continue. Go ahead, Ms. Lattanzio. Mr. Chair, is that better? Yes. I'm sorry. I hope that you stopped the timer for a few seconds. Now, for Mr. Leckey, today we spoke at length about this.
We'll ask questions to you, Mr. Leakey. Again, can you speak to each level of government's jurisdictions with regards to official languages?
Madame Lattanzio, je m'excuse encore une fois. Bon,
I'm sorry, Ms. Lattanzio. I let you have enough time to ask your question, but time is up since you shared your time with your two other colleagues. So now Mr. Beaulieu has 7 minutes. Mr. Chair, I don't want to be awkward. I'm sorry. But since the time is up, might I ask the witness to send his written response to the clerk? Yes, certainly. That is why I left you enough time to ask the question. So if our witness would like to submit a brief, we will be very glad to take those into consideration. So, Mr. Beaulieu, you have 7 minutes. Thank you. Now, the killer question. Mr. Leckey, you often come back to the Constitution. Equality of status never worked because after 52 years of the Official Languages Act, French continues to decline across Canada and English remains the predominant language in federal institutions, even in Quebec. My question is for all witnesses. What do you think of the fact that the Constitution was imposed in 1962 on the French minority in Quebec, and that the Charter of the French language was enshrined, and that the federal regime does nothing but strengthen English in Quebec? Would someone like to respond? Who is the question for? For all three witnesses. The first witness who wants to take the floor may take the floor. Ms. Meggs, please go ahead. Thank you. Well, it is very clear that there are many elements of the Canadian Constitution and many elements of the federal official languages regime that are harmful to French in Quebec. That is very clear. So if no one else wants to respond, could you just give an example? So the 1982 Constitution and the OLA is founded on a principle that does not protect the linguistic minority, because in every country where there are multiple official languages, the only countries that do not have assimilation problems are the countries that use a regional model. Because in a country, if you try to impose this regime of language of choice, it doesn't work. There has to be a common language in a given region. Yes, in Quebec, if the French language is not strong enough in Quebec, in my opinion, French elsewhere, other than in Canada, is even more fragilized. It is of critical importance to maintain this stronghold of French where there is, in principle, a critical mass of Francophones to be able to do that, so that we can then say, well, we as Francophones are not only in Quebec, we are elsewhere as well, and Francophones elsewhere also need to be supported. But if we don't maintain this stronghold of French in Quebec, it will be very difficult to protect minority Francophone communities in Canada outside of Quebec. And to change this, to change the federal language policy to allow French to thrive and grow in Quebec, I think what that will take would be a very significant change, because what we're seeing is that the federal government doesn't want to let the Quebec government have that authority. So, does the anglicizing effect of the federal regime have a harmful effect, and shouldn't we mobilize in a significant way to change this? My question is for Mr. Bolduc. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. I'm sure that you won't be surprised to hear from me, from the FTQ, that we believe that Quebec should have its independence. I think that we would be able to protect our language more if, as the only French territory in North America, we're drowning in a sea of English.
And now, when the Quebec government talks about reforming any reforms to Bill 101, and people are talking about the notwithstanding clause already, just to be sure that what the Quebec government decides will not be able to be undone, because the Quebec government is legitimately elected by the people of Quebec. Do you believe that the people of Quebec are aware? I mean, I'm the one who introduced the motion for this study, and people said, no, we don't want the federal government to get involved in the whole issue of languages. But the federal government is already involved. When you think about official languages community programs, 55 million, doesn't include the various English language institutions, Quebec Community Network Group, and then official languages, Vitality program, $20 million, $23 million in 2015-2016. The amount changes from year to year. Then contributions for English language, official languages to fund learning of English for Quebec civil servants. Do you think that Quebec's population is aware of all of these programs? Because these are funded by Quebec taxpayers' monies that they also pay, and they are only being used to strengthen English in Quebec. Are people aware of this? The great majority is not aware of this. Well, I think that if we manage to make people aware of this, that will already provoke some sort of reaction which will help change or put pressure on the federal government to change its language policy. Because just, the fact that the situation of French in Quebec was never studied, the impact of the language policy in 52 years, I mean, that shows. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to what I've just said. No, I think you're absolutely right. The money that's spent to promote English in Quebec could be used to help Francophones outside Quebec. And we're talking about institutional completeness. The more language group institutions are strong, the more they'll be able to attract people to that language. Because in addition to those programs, if you talk about the fact that it's over 38% federal funding is given to English language universities, likewise, same thing all over the place. Thank you very much, Mr. Beaulieu.
Are going to be asked by Mrs. Ashton for 7 minutes. Please go.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is for Mr. Bolduc. According to you, what should the government do, concretely speaking, to ensure that Quebecers have the right to work in the language of their choice? Well, to say so loud and clear. I was giving the example earlier of the fact that the government has to set the example. The government has to apply measures so that in the civil service, people in Quebec have to be able to work in French all across Quebec's territory. That's basic. It's elementary. But, it all starts from there. You have to lead by example. We have to implement mechanisms by which people will maybe do more advertising. You're in Quebec. You can work in French. It's a right. It's a right, working in French in Quebec. Thank you for that. Your clear message. Next question for Ms. Meggs. According to you, what are the Canadian and Quebec immigration needs? What should the Official Languages Act be putting forth in terms of migration policy? Well, I think the federal government has for a long time had a policy of trying to get French language immigrants from elsewhere, and that actually is in competition in a way with the Quebec-Canada agreement, because Quebec is trying to select. That's why I was emphasizing temporary immigrants. Quebec wants to select immigrants who already speak French before they come to Canada or Quebec. That's what makes a difference. Francization, once they get here, is much more difficult. People get established, they organize themselves as they can. That's what life is all about. They're human beings, after all. But it's at the point of selection. And we have a lot of temporary immigration. Maybe in the conditions for issuing work permits, we could have measures to encourage employers to think of French when they're bringing people in from abroad. This is something that would help. How do you conceive of linguistic duality between English and French speakers in our society? Question for me again? Yes. How do I perceive it? Well, on an individual basis, I can't say that it's an enormous source of richness to be able to communicate in both languages. Even more than that. My kids speak, 3 or 4 languages, I feel like I'm a little bit deficient. But it's an advantage for Canada. But if we want it to continue to be an advantage, we have to protect French, because English is not in danger. It's the lingua franca internationally. If we want to maintain this idea of 2 official languages with people in Canada who have this heritage of both languages, the French side is the side that needs protection and promotion. Thank you very much to you, Ms. Meggs. I'd like to ask a question of Professor Leckie. You have openly stated that French has opened doors for you, and that way you really wanted to learn the language and speak it fluently. Do you believe that the decline of French is associated with any popular negligence? Well, I'll get back to my situation and what I said at the beginning of my comments. To promote a language, you should be encouraging the teaching of French as a second language in every university in the country. I am sorry that when I got to Montreal, I had to work so hard to improve my French. I didn't get the kind of training I would have wanted to have in Ontario, and I think we have to renew in every province of the country. We renew our efforts so that French is taught well, appreciated well, and that there could be easy access to culture in French. There's a tremendous amount of cultural richness in Quebec, but that's not necessarily shared in the other provinces sometimes. Sometimes Quebec's culture is consumed more in Europe than elsewhere in this country, and I find that sad. Of course, it's a great source of richness to have this heritage. But I think our minority French communities are a source of strength for French. Our French communities outside Quebec. Thank you. I'm a Manitoban, but my favorite city in Quebec, in Canada, is Montreal. There's a whole fan club here in the rest of Canada. As I wanted to ask you, how can we reconcile English and French in a minority context without harming the rights of Francophones? How to reconcile the two without harming which rights? The rights of Francophones. How can you reconcile English and French in a minority context while still respecting the rights of Francophones? Honestly, I apologize. I'm not sure that I really understood your question. Perhaps you could share how either in Quebec or elsewhere, you use the example of universities, how could we ensure that French is promoted, that English is promoted, depending on the context? While ensuring that Francophones' rights are known and respected. You have 10 seconds, Mr. Leckie. Or if you have any general thoughts on the subject. Well, people have to make efforts at every jurisdiction of government. Steps taken by the two levels of government would not be the same. There should be complementarity rather than total standardization. Thank you very much. This is all the time that we have for today for this session of the Official Languages Committee. On behalf of all the members of the committee and of the entire technical team, I would like to thank all of our witnesses for having participated today, and thank you also for these most constructive exchanges. So I would like to thank personally Mr. Robert Dean Leckie, Samuel Gill Professor, Faculty of Law at McGill University, appearing on behalf of Anne-Michel Meggs, former Research Director at the Office québécois de la langue française, and on behalf of the Fédération des travailleurs travailleuses de Québec, thank you to Denis Bolduc, General Secretary, and Gilles Gondin, Union Advisor. So thank you, and I'd like to take this opportunity to tell the members that the next two sessions, because there are people who are following our meetings, the next two sessions will be in camera because we'll be looking at this study on the COVID report that you're going to be receiving. And in closing, thank you again to the entire technical team for supporting us today. And I think there's one question, Ms. Lalonde, go ahead. Yes, just 30 seconds. I'm sorry. I don't want to impose anything, but could the analyst let us know when we will be able to access a first version of the COVID report? We received it this afternoon, approximately 4 p.m. I believe that the analysts would be able to tell us whether it's either this afternoon or sometime tomorrow. Ms. Lecomte, could you tell us? The report was prepared for distribution, and I will let the clerk answer the question as to the timing, but I think you're right, Mr. Chair. I think it's either this evening or tomorrow morning. Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Godin, go ahead. Yes, Chair. At the last meeting before this one, we ended very briefly and I sent you some corrections. What's the next step? The next step is that today, well, you know, it takes a long time when you move from an in-camera session to a public session. So I didn't want to have an in-camera session today. That's why we kept the two sessions. But starting next week on Tuesday, we'll be back in camera for the next two sessions. And at that point, it would be a better time to talk about the press release, which will be fairly quick. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. And I wish our witnesses a safe return trip, even if you're actually home. So happy logging out and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. The session is terminated.